topic which most of the members that we have interacted with, irrespective of which stakeholder they are, whether it's a startup or government or even the funders, who seem to, we don't seem to crack this. Everybody who has money wants to fund, everybody who is an innovator needs the fund, but somehow the is not matching. So the whole purpose of this session is to find out what is it that funders really expect when they look at a proposal, and how can we bridge this gap. So to anchor this session, I'd like to invite the panel chair and our advisory group member, Mr. Srikanth Viswanathan, onto the dais. A round of applause, please. Thank you. As we mentioned yesterday, we are not introducing the speakers in the interest of time. They're all given in the agenda booklet. So I request you to please familiarize yourself with the speakers if you don't already know them. May I now request Mr. Thomas Kress from USAID-India to please come onto the dais. Welcome, sir. Mr. Ravi Narayan, CEO of T-Hub. Mr. Abhishek Poduri, Tata Trust Zonal Head South. Mr. Vineeth Menon, Associate Vice President, Intellecap. And Mr. Bharath, Director Investments, Omidyar Network India. Thank you. So Srikanth, over to you.
So before Mr. Srikanth takes over, this session is primarily targeting the innovators, startups. So our friends from municipalities and corporations who are sitting at the back, most of you may feel, "Humko kya hai?" It's very important to understand the challenges of raising resources for these individuals to put their time, money, resources, effort to bring to you. So please appreciate the pain that somebody goes through before they connect with you. So I think you need to understand also there is a great deal of learning that cities also can gain from this conversation of how the money actually gets mobilized in the sector. Over to you, Srikanth.
Thank you, Professor Chari. Panel discussion, but more as a moderated group discussion for two reasons. One is there's emerging evidence to suggest that more than select experts, it's crowdsourcing of ideas, the wisdom of crowds that will probably solve 21st century challenges. And secondly, this is an all-male panel. And as most of you know, it's men who are above the age of 40 who created most of the problems of the 21st century or have left them unsolved. So it's important for us to get in women voices as well. So what we'll do is we'll get in some women's voices during the panel discussion itself, and we'll try and prioritize questions from women's entrepreneurs and the other wise women in the group as part of the Q&A as well. I am not here in the capacity of a subject matter expert. I don't understand WASH very well. Neither am I an expert in startup or VC, but there are two things that I do well. One is I ask tough questions on subjects that I don't know about. And secondly, I keep to time. So I assure you that we will close sharp at 1 p.m., which is the closure time for the session. I think 21st century is going to be a century of unprecedented challenges and opportunities for humankind. The scale of challenges that we will have to solve, whether it is water sanitation and hygiene, or climate change, or women's empowerment, or rebuilding trust in democracy, is happening at a scale that we've never seen before. So we are essentially, this is the dawn of a new age. And therefore, the solutions of the 20th century, both in terms of products, processes, or partnerships, cannot solve 21st century challenges. So that would be the overarching context, I guess, in which we should have this conversation. I'm going to therefore put, my first question to, if I may, to Bharath. Given that Omidyar network works across geographies around the world and works across a variety of areas of governance and citizen engagement, my first question to you, Bharath, is water, sanitation and health in India surely is a wicked problem. But the fact of the matter is, The question that comes to mind is, why do we really need innovations in wash, given that there are dozens of countries around the world who, through the public sector alone, have essentially solved these challenges? So developed economies around the world, or even some of our peer economies, few of our peer economies, have managed to solve wash challenges beginning from the 19th century. Why do we really need innovations in wash?
Thanks, Srikanth. I think it's a great question to begin with. I'm looking at these kinds of problems across different countries for a while now. But the sense that we certainly get sitting in India is that many of our problems are actually fairly unique. So while it may be true that many other countries have solved these challenges, I think when you try to transport those solutions to the Indian context, I think things start to break down. Beginning even with simple things like the pace at which we are actually urbanizing right now. And the fact that infrastructure is so far behind right now, that when you look at many models that exist for solving problems, especially in the wash type area, they don't seem to port very well actually. And so I think when you flip that and you say, what is it then that will cause these problems to get solved? It seems clear that it requires a very heavy dose of innovation. And I think that's going to come from the kinds of entrepreneurs that we've seen across these 2 days here already. I mean, unfortunately, I missed yesterday, but from some of the stories that I heard and from some of the stories this morning, clearly there is a very, very exciting sort of phase of innovation that's happening in these problems. And that innovation needs to be sort of accepted and taken into the public sector as quickly as possible. So I think the question here is not so much what can we learn from what is happening in other parts of the world, but what can we learn from the entrepreneurs like we are seeing in this room, who are doing incredibly innovative stuff, and how can that be absorbed into the public system as quickly as possible? And because ultimately there's no doubt that for these solutions to scale, they have to be absorbed by the public sector. So the question becomes, what is the mechanism by which these solutions can be taken and absorbed into the public sector, such that these solutions reach the scale that they need to reach as quickly as possible. So that's the way I would think about it.
Sure, thanks, Bharath. I'd like to now go to, which is working on water, sanitation and health issues across the globe, including in India. And the question I want to ask you is the overarching global context with respect to developed economies, because even as we think that the developed economies have indeed, in the past, solved many of these challenges, perhaps infrastructure is getting creaky. And perhaps there are concerns that replacing that old infrastructure with the same old technologies may not work. So where do you see the role for innovations in water, sanitation and health from a global perspective, so we're able to dovetail the India piece into that?
Sure, thank you for the question. Just to clarify, I am not Thomas Kress. You see the good-looking gentleman up there in that picture, that is not me. My name is Eric Naranjo. My background is in finance, so I do appreciate the WASH question. I wish it was a finance question, but let me give you my best shot. So the role of AID is a donor, and we do have that global vision. So in terms of innovation and how that really pushes the envelope in that global context is a very important one. I've actually dovetailed off of Omidyar's response in the sense that innovation really is a trigger, is a catalyst of small ideas into big movements. And when exciting innovations come out of the Indian context or the African context or another economy, folks like donor agencies like ourselves are too eager to push to scale and really show the market that there are different ways of doing things. Another part of USAID is engaging with the government. So again, I applaud Omidyar's response. What we'd like to do is help the government to improve their capacity to find solutions that have an overall impact that may be better than what's going on today. So innovation is a very exciting thing. Let me just take this question to parlay into a little bit of finance. What AID is hopeful to do a little more of is to be able to scale those innovations. So what we're trying to do in the local context is reduce that risk perception that lenders would have to lend into the sector. Our credit guarantee program is generally a 50% pari passu credit guarantee that shares risk with lenders in order to make these bets that we're talking about in different markets. So we're very excited about our program, and innovation in India is a beautiful thing. It is incredible India after all.
Thank you, Eric. I'm going to now come to Abhishek, and on two related aspects. One is the question of state capacities. which is one of the reasons why we need a three-way partnership between civil society, markets, and government to solve 21st century challenges in India, irrespective of the global context. And the second is a role played by organizations like yourselves in stitching together these partnerships. So it almost seems like there are two kinds of innovations that may be necessary, and both of which will require adequate and appropriate funding. One is product innovation, but equally also innovations in coalitions, partnerships, and processes, and value chains, so to speak, in bringing these disparate actors together and delivering last mile results.
Thanks, Srikanth. I think you've given the answer yourself actually. We need innovations in both. So look, I'll just combine both the answers. So typically, all these stakeholders, governments, private players, philanthropies, startups have a specific role to play. The scalability is obviously done by the government because none of these players will be able to scale at the level the problem needs a solution today. While the private players will be able to bring in the intellectual capability to come up with products and solutions, and startups will be able to bring in the speed at which the products can be given to the market. The role of philanthropies are very critical because I'm also a part of that. To stitch this together, as you rightly put in, because most of the times what has happened is that governments are quite slow for whatever reasons, and we can't blame them. At the same time, the capital required is not available with most of these players to scale this up. So some of the pilots which have actually been demonstrated on the fields have not been able to scale up. And a lot of technologies today exist, and a lot of successful technologies exist, but they're inconsequential because the scaling capacity has not been demonstrated. So that's where philanthropies actually come in and then ensure that these go-to-market products are taken and demonstrated on the field, because sustainability is key, because everybody talks about sustainability, and we have seen personally that when we move out of a project, the programs typically tend to fail because the communities are not able to adopt to it, the governments are not able to scale the program. So that's where we are working very closely with governments. We are also working closely with the private players to come up with solutions. At the same time, we understand that there is a deficit for social sector ecosystem, for which we are trying to create an ecosystem through our grantees such as Social Alpha and all, where we are looking at creating, a platform where startups can come, and get incubated. And also at the same time, because see, most of the investors today are funding mainstream programs, but the need is actually at the early stage for science and technology, where there are a lot of ideas, but there is no funding, and that's where we feel that we are trying to bring that together in a small way. What we are trying to do is to stitch all this, and also take it to the governments so that they see the need of it. So we are acting as the facilitators in this, and that's where we feel that the need is today.
Thank you. I want to bring in Ravi and Vineeth at this point, who are in fact very key people to this conversation. They're the magicians who know how to unlock the money for these kind of investments in some ways. So Ravi, if I can, stitching this conversation together from where we started, if you can call out the contemporary trends that you're seeing with respect to startups, and in particular financing of startups. I think that'll be a good segue into a more focused conversation on financing of startups, particularly in the wash sector. So some kind of a landscape overview of where you see the current stage of maturity and evolution of the startup sector in India and where you see it going. Some key trends would be useful.
Thanks, Srikanth. If you don't mind, shall I just take a quick poll of how many startups there are in the audience? So how many of you are there? How many startups? Can you raise your hand? Okay. It's about 20, 25 of them. Okay. And how many of you have already raised some kind of money in the past? 1, 2. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think this is the nature of the landscape, if you will. There are several startups. They start out their journeys as a technology innovation of some sort. They are able to work with one customer, maybe a couple of customers, and then the big question becomes, okay, how do you create innovations in other ways in terms of process innovation, business model innovation, and so on and so forth, to really scale it and take it to the next level. And that's where a lot of these things start getting into some kind of a problem. And this is not, not uncharacteristic of any startup landscape. This is how it was in the for-profit, venture-backable startup thing just about 12, 13 years ago. All these unicorns that you talk about in the other space was exactly in the same space before, because they knew how to solve this, because these guys were very smart engineers who had come out with a lot of passion to solve a particular problem. They solved it, but it was just a technology innovation. They just didn't know how to make a business around it, and that's what was important for an investor to start getting involved in that journey. So what you will see is, while you may be doing a great job of doing this at that particular scale, that may be great enough for you. It may be taking up all of your energies and all of your intellect in making that thing work. It is when you are able to not only solve the problem at a larger scale and get people excited about wanting to be part of that journey, that's when it starts happening. So if you really look at how many investors there are in this ecosystem today, they're not too many. Maybe with 30, 35 of them are in the social impact investment sector. I don't have any latest numbers in this space, but between 2010 and 2016, there were a little bit about $5.5 billion got invested, and most of these things I think came from the foundations, not necessarily from venture capital per se in this space. But it is rising. 2016 itself saw $1.1 billion going into the startups in this space, and it's very important to look at this as an indicator of what really is happening in terms of innovation, because startups are the most exciting, the most innovative, the most nimble, the most needy elements of an ecosystem, which will go pick the technology from wherever it may be, in a lab of some kind, maybe in a research or an academic institution, or it may be their own innovation per se. They bring it to the real world very quickly, because they are trying to solve a problem that they have a visceral understanding of, and they want to take it on and make that happen. So if you are able to help these people who are solving this problem where the rubber meets the road, obviously you are doing something to really create some transformative, some disruptive solutions. And that is what is required because of the kinds of the immensity of the problems that are there in this country. It's a very important thing to solve for. I will talk about this a little bit more, but what we are trying to do here in Hyderabad is actually bring several different institutions together to actually create that ecosystem for them. Because there is so much naivete about raising money. You are looking to raise money, okay, somebody says he's into capital. So there's a huge difference between how you approach an Omidyar network versus, let's say, a Tata Trust. But that discernment only comes over a period of time. The ecosystem has to take its time. But if there is any way for us to accelerate that whole path, I think it will be so much easier for them to go to the right place, make the right pitch, and really take it forward. So that's kind of the way I see what's happening in the startup ecosystem on the social side.
Thank you, Ravi. Very, very useful landscape. So Vineeth, coming to you, I'd like you to weigh in on the same question, but also add another question taking off from what Ravi mentioned about about, as he put it, the naivete about raising capital. Raising capital, as you know, is indeed an exclusive club, even globally, if I may say so. But it almost seems ironical that on the one hand you have trillions of dollars of investable capital, including in the ESG sector in Europe and the US. And you have prima facie investable opportunities in India for solving many of these challenges and real problems that billions of people in India face. So in addition to weighing in on the landscape of the startup ecosystem, if you could add on to it by saying, what are a couple of things that you think are key to unlocking large amounts of capital and making them available in India for social investments?
The first thing which comes to my mind is they need to have a good business plan, business model. So, like my fellow panelists said, it's not only about technology, it's more about how do you know how to run the business. That has been the prima facie observations. Intellecap is also part of an impact fund, Avishkar, and I'm talking from the point of view of Avishkar. We have, till date, I'm trying to give you a landscape of how the investments pan out. Till date, we have invested in 60 plus enterprises, 60 plus startups. But if you see, out of WASH, it's only 3. Just 3 number, and that too, the last investment which we made was in 2013. But we have been making investments. We have been making investments in other sectors. So what are the other sectors showcasing or portraying which the WASH sector is unable to do? One prima facie thing which comes to my mind is scale. And I won't say it's the fault of the startup. Currently, the WASH enterprises are unable to showcase scalability. How can the ecosystem come together to prove this is one good example, which is Maharashtra Innovation Society, which is conducting a similar event for startups. But the prize money, apart from the prize money, they're giving a 1-year piloting experience with any of the government setups. So if it's a healthcare startup, they are put up in a government hospital and enable them to run it. So it's through such a mechanism, the startup is able to pilot their product, get qualified for tender conditions, because finally the government is the largest buyer in this country. They end up participating and end up showing scale in their project. That's, I feel, is one of the key when it comes to how do you unlock capital. Few trends, the second part of your question, few trends which we are observing, and probably it started some time back, but it's picking up steam, is we have seen corporates entering this world a lot. If you talk about the SL group, I'm moving away from WASH. So the Z group, the Z TV group runs a media incubator, media accelerator through their CSR program. Now the best of those startups get investments from the Z group. Similarly, yes, bank also runs some institute, yes, incubator. So we have seen a lot of corporates coming in, and the one example which I said, government is also taking some initiative to involve these corporates, these startups into their mechanism.
Thanks, Vineeth. So there are 3-4 key trends. So I have one follow-up question to Bharath and to Eric before I start taking in some voices from all of you, and then we can engage in a collective conversation. The 3-4 things that I could sort of suss out from Ravi's and Vineeth's observations. One is on scale, second is on business plan, and the third is engagement with government procurement. So I'm going to double click on these 3 before we go into the others. The 3 are of course interrelated, they're not different from each other. But so my question to Bharath and to Eric is the significance of blended finance and also philanthropic grants, particularly in the social sector, to help nurture this ecosystem and individual enterprises. And the reason I'm saying this is it almost seems like, as far as the traditional private sector market is concerned, it appears that they find ways of getting mentored. They find ways of getting mentored, and the brighter folks are able to attract enough capital to then attract talent to figure out the problems of business plan and scale, etc. Whereas it appears to be one of the shortcomings of this sector. And that is where perhaps philanthropic grants plus blended finance gives them that headroom to invest in adequate amounts of talent and to do some amount of experimentation, etc. So it'll be good to hear from both of you on the role of blended finance, on the need for a two checkbook approach as one of the pioneers, OM, have demonstrated. It'll be good to hear from you on the significance of that and your experience with it.
Sure, I think it's a very crucial point, Srikanth, in the evolution, I think, of this space, because I think that the problems that you touched upon are exactly the right ones, right? How do you effectively scale? Because if you don't effectively scale, there's no reason for capital to be chasing the idea. So the question of what is the role of blended finance, I think, is an important one. It's also not as straightforward as it might seem at first, right? Because when you often, I mean, certainly with some sort of blended finance models such as ours, I think our approach tends to be, when we look at our dual checkbook, we look at it as grants that we deploy primarily to non-profits, as well as equity investments that we make in for-profits. But when you look at a model that is a for-profit one, but without a great business model backing it to begin with, that is not necessarily a place where we would say that, you know, the dual checkbook model is the right, that's not necessarily the right place to take the dual checkbook model. Right? But at the same time, I think there is a role for philanthropic capital there. So the question of, you know, if a philanthropist is looking to make a grant in the wash sector, and you see a promising innovation, and we've seen many of these examples here, would the philanthropic capital be better deployed in a space like this to be able to help achieve at least a certain amount of scale, at least a proof of concept, at least a certain demonstration effect? I think is a very valuable one, and I'd love to see actually more innovation happen there. I don't think we've seen as much of it as we should, but I definitely think there's a lot of room there. I do also think at the same time that there's a room for innovation across the rest of the ecosystem as well. I mean, the Maharashtra State Innovation Society example was mentioned, we need to talk about that. I think this question of what is the role that government can play there to actually help catalyze this ecosystem, I think, is a really important one. Right? So you talked about the question of procurement as well. When we talk to a lot of startups that work in this space, the biggest bottleneck they tell us is, well, how do we actually get these contracts from government? And so this question of what is the innovation and the government procurement mechanism, I think, is an extremely crucial one. So whether it's models like what the Maharashtra State Innovation Society has done, providing contracts to people who have been chosen through a process like this, right, where there's no question that sort of, you know, there was no sort of bias in the picking process, but there's also not the constraints of the L1, L2 model. And that seems to be a very promising approach. A couple of other things that we've started to see state governments talk about, which I personally feel quite excited about. I think a few state governments are starting to talk about, you know, to encourage innovation like this. Is it necessary, and is it feasible for us to set up seed funds of our own? Like, so for the government to actually say we'll provide a pool of seed funding for civic tech startups, as we think of them, you know, startups that are solving civic challenges. Could that be a mechanism to, first of all, signal the government's own skin in the game, and therefore signal their readiness to actually help those startups scale? Right? So something like that, plus the blended finance model that you talked about, so, you know, government money, philanthropic money, plus reforms in procurement, I think are the kinds of things that will be needed to help achieve scale. So that's the way I would describe it.
Thank you, Bharath. Eric, if I could request you to weigh in, and particularly the interesting trend that's been happening in the last 2-3 years is how bilaterals and multilaterals are slowly pivoting away from plain untied aid and grants to the country, to the governments, to looking at, you know, some form of aid for trade arrangement through social investments, through investing in startups, etc. So if you could touch on two things. One is the original question to Bharath, on which I'd like you to weigh in. But the second important point is, how do you see this in terms of trade relationships and exchange of technology and ideas between markets? Because one thing that we are seeing is agencies like USAID providing technical assistance to governments rather than larger scale aid is also resulting in probably some kind of trade exchange with where in your case more US companies bidding for contracts in the public sector, including in WASH, and that energizing the local ecosystem. So if you could address both of these before we start taking in voices from the audience.
Great. Thank you for the question. I'll hit on the first one first. Blended finance, I think, is a wonderful thing that's taking shape in India. I think of finance as water. That water can flow into a given pot in any form and shape of that form. I think an excellent role for blended finance really is the delta between the perceived risk from a lender's perspective, and then what that entrepreneur can afford, which would be that pricing. And so that delta there is a wonderful way to really benefit both parties. I think maybe to caveat into that second point, I think having a pay for success model is a really rich form of being able really to put teeth on grant money. As you already mentioned, donor agencies like USAID have historically given out grants and just hope and pray for some sort of impact. These days, and in the Indian market context, there's a wonderful model that's being played out, the development impact bond model, and then hopefully the social impact bond model, where governments are actually paying for the success of the implementation of whatever intervention. And so I think that's a natural next step for the Indian context, where government can amend their Companies Act law and allow for clarity for corporates to crowd in funding that actually requires impact instead of the traditional model that unfortunately donor agencies like myself have been subject to. So I would leave at those 2 points. One, that blended finance is a wonderful thing that's happening in the market. I think it has an excellent role, and I think that kind of carries into your second point, which is if and when the government of India can amend and clarify the Companies Act to allow for pay for success models, then you're really driving innovation, and then an ecosystem around these things can formulate. For example, that social stock exchange that's been discussed recently.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. How many of you, particularly startup co-founders or even government officials, how many of you don't know what blended finance is? So there are quite a few, at least a dozen hands who are not familiar with blended finance. So do you want to continue and just define blended finance very quickly?
It's very basic. It's market capital, right? So if you're going to go out and get a mortgage, or you're going to go out and buy a car, there's a general market rate for that. Let's pretend that that's a 15% number. And I like to think of it as a cocktail, right? So you take your market rate funds and introduce your soft money or your grant money, and let's call that 0%, or maybe in some cases 2 or 3%. So it's soft capital, it's not market. You combine those into a rich cocktail, you serve it up to your best friends, and that's a reduced rate of return. Maybe it's a muted rate of return for whatever intervention, and essentially it's the combination of those two that is the blend of finance. And I think here in India they're doing a wonderful job of innovating around that model.
Thank you for that. So we'll now start opening this up. We still have a good 45 minutes, I think, for a healthy conversation. Do bear in mind that the Q&A format facilitates questions from here to there and there to here. And the gentlemen that you have here, there's Tata Trust, there's Ravi from T-Hub, there is USAID, which is part of the government of the United States. There is Intellecap and Avishkar, there is Omidyar network. These gentlemen are capable of at least collectively corralling in $500 million over the next 5 years, quite easily, without much trouble. So do challenge them, do ask them all the doubts and questions that you have. I'm going to first start by putting a question to Deepthi, who's just walked in, who runs a very interesting women's entrepreneurship hub in Telangana. She's had an interesting journey herself transitioning into this. And my first question, so I'm going to stay with 4 perspectives in this conversation. There's one perspective on gender, and I'm particularly focusing on that because of the lack of balance in this panel, and also the emerging significance of gender as a lever for wider social influence to tackle 21st century challenges. right? And this has been probably one of the persistent roadblocks in solving some of these challenges equitably. The second is on scale. The third is business plan, which were key words. And the fourth is government procurement and engagement. So I'm going to stick with these 4 themes, and I'm going to prioritize voices from startup entrepreneurs and from government. We have 2 senior officials that I can see here from the Thiruvananthapuram Municipal Corporation, I think the mayor and the secretary. So we'll get their voices in as well. But like I said, priority first to women's voices. Deepti first. How significant do you think is enabling women's entrepreneurship in general in the social space, but more particularly in the wash space, and your experience with VHub on that? And if I may request all of you to keep your comments short and crisp so we can get a variety of voices in.
So first, thank you for acknowledging the very nice fact. Yes, you need to have a more balanced panel. And again, the incubator for women entrepreneurs and a government initiative. What we are working towards is working with various government departments internally in the government of Telangana, and with our innovation partners such as you have Ravi there. We also have TSIC. We also have emerging trends. We also have a lot of enablers which we have created within the government to enable more women to be entrepreneurs. And personally, the bigger...
Thanks, Deepti. I want to now get Maya in. Maya Vivek runs an interesting enterprise that works on proper disposal of flower waste, and she did speak yesterday very evocatively and passionately about the work she does. So one comment from you, Maya, on whatever you've heard, and one question from you to the panel on essentially what the gentleman said, that scale and business plan, they are saying, scalability and business plan, they are saying, are the things which can unlock capital. So one question from you on the challenge that you face and where you need support. So one comment and one question.
Okay. First, my comment on, first is the panel that is on stage, and you did start off saying that it is not balanced, but definitely I would like to congratulate the panel here for being sensitive. One is about not being balanced, of course, but then coming up with the aspects of problems that these startups are facing, including women entrepreneurs right now. One, of course, I would really like to thank Mr. Ravi Narayan for pointing out the naivety part, which I guess Deepti also would recall the first time that we went to VHub. I don't come from a management background, although I have been working in an MNC, but then I do not talk jargons. We were all set to go as an NGO, and it was VHub who pushed us to become an enterprise, and that's how we started thinking on that, in that direction. So definitely naivety, yes. Now, with that kind of a team, I mean, all the women, and of course, like, empowerment and enterprise do not, shouldn't be, mixed. This is another thing which she mentioned, which resonates with me as well. Now, I have been empowered in the sense that, I would earn my own livelihood. I was working, but at the same time, yes, I mean, how good was my empowerment or the enlightenment that I had? How good was it to translate my enterprise into a fun, attractive one? Okay, I mean, I had to make a business model, I had to approach people for funding, but how much did it really attract? Now, here is the team, or there are kind of people here who can work out an ecosystem to come up to an enterprise, especially in the wash segment, especially in the women entrepreneurship segment, and realize how much can they help us, to come up with such a model. Maybe translation is a problem, in getting funds, of course, and you all would realize that funding is very, very important for a sustainable model to really work. So definitely, I mean, all of us coming together, having an ecosystem, build that particular, aspect for an aspiring enterprise is definitely is crucial. And that is what I would request the panelists here, the people present here from all segments, to come up with.
Sure. Thanks, Maya. I'll put that question back to the panel in a bit. If I can get one of the strong voices that has been backstage for most of the time, but has been very closely involved with the ink and wash process and the entire thing, is Malini. And the question I have for Malini is, you have the benefit of having looked at all the 150 proposals that came to you as part of this entire process, many of whom were very passionate and strong women entrepreneurs as well. So if you could weigh in on the discussion so far with a specific lens on women's entrepreneurship and the relationship of that to government procurement, to government engagement, and the policy framework that's required for this.
So, my understanding is that currently there are very few states, and we can actually count them on the fingertips, like Andhra, Telangana, Odisha, Kerala, which have some government networks available to support women entrepreneurship. So whether it is MEPMA in Andhra and Telangana or a Kudumbushri, which take up skilling and funding women enterprises. However, these also exist for a particular segment of the society, which is largely the self-help group. So these loans are not really accessible to all the women in all segments of the society. That's one. The other thing is the kind of skilling and for the kind of jobs or for the kind of products also seem to be at a very low end. They are not skilling them to start entrepreneurial ventures for high-tech products, and therefore the return on investment invariably tends to be quite low. I think there is a need for having, there is also a socio-cultural aspect, and this to Dipti's point about empowerment, that sometimes we, with good intentions, you might take up training, but society might not be ready to accept it. A case in point is Mason training program, and you take a women Mason training, and you might not find takers, even if the woman is really very well qualified. Therefore, I think it's important to have some gender intentional policies, which is not just in terms of skilling them, in terms of providing them with funding support, but there should be some market linkage assurance also given so that these enterprises can really succeed and thrive. VHub is an example of a fantastic example of government-supported network to promote entrepreneurship, and I think Dipti has a big task on hand to first figure out how she will scale up to other states before the other entrepreneurs figure out how they should scale. Thank you.
And then Ajit is touching on a point that Malini raised, and then the leaders from Thiruvananthapuram.
Srikanth, may I just add one thing here? So VHub, while it is a government of Telangana initiative, it is to promote entrepreneurship among women across India. And we want this to be like how we created T-Hub. You know, when the government of Telangana created T-Hub and it's become a role model for every other state to emulate, we want to do the same with VHub as well. So that is one thing I just want to
fantastic. That's a message to all the women entrepreneurs from outside of Telangana. Any women entrepreneurs from outside of Telangana? So I can see 2 hands. I can see 3 hands here. So do catch hold of Deepthi after this session. Now I want to quickly go to Vineeth, Ravi, and to Abhishek to get a response on a couple of things that have been said here. We have the leaders from Thiruvananthapuram here, and Malini referred to the Kudumbashri program, right? And the Kudumbashri program is targeted at women and typically at the lower end of the socio-economic demography. And similarly, in India, we have generally seen self-help groups, which are women, contribute immensely to unlocking capital. Right? There have been ups and downs. We've seen that in the microfinance industry in the past, but by and large, the SHG mobilization has held up a huge lesson, both in entrepreneurship and in social change. How do we translate that success to a different demography, to a different use case? That's one question. And the other question is the feasibility of what Malini, Deepthi, and Maya referred to of gender-focused, capacity building, if you will, or gender-focused enablement of business planning, of scalability, of unlocking capital, and so on, by creating ecosystems like T-Hub and VHub. So essentially, T-Hub and V-Hub are two important use cases that have come up in the last 2 years, but there's a need to now transformatively scale it. So it's pretty much the challenge that you threw to the entrepreneurs is now coming back to you. Right? They are basically saying, we have the ideas, we have the passion, you guys now go out and create ecosystems which can, scale your ecosystems so we can then scale our businesses. I'll come to you in a minute, Aditi. Vineeth and Ravi and Abhishek, and in case Bharath and Eric want to add to that, feel free to that. Vineeth?
Okay, I'll take the second question because that's more closer to me. When we talk about creating a hub specifically for women, I'm taking some examples of similar hubs which were created, not necessarily only exclusive for women, but open for all. The first thing which they cracked, I'm talking about the successful ones, the first thing which they cracked is probably having an access to an angel network and having a continuous showcase, maybe events like this.
Can you demystify what an angel network is? Okay. For those of them who may not know. So we keep it simple, go back to the basics.
Sorry, let's not, okay, let me tell what an angel network is. It's not a typical investor like an Omidyar or an Avishkar. Not necessarily an investor like that, but there are some individuals who are interested in funding early stage, providing seed capital to people. There are different angels networks like Mumbai Angels. I'm sure there should be something in Hyderabad as well, but I'm sure there is a Mumbai Angel. Yeah, do you have? Okay, I didn't know that. So these are angel networks who are willing to experiment with their hard-earned money, but are also willing to provide that seed capital which is required. So if you directly start approaching an impact investor or even an investor who has grown out, probably they are not looking at seed capital. There is no discrimination in terms of gender. That's what I want to convey. But at least they're looking at a ticket size which is larger than what you want or what you can consume. So maybe for that seed stage, you need to access angel network, and maybe people like we can have these short Shark Tank kind of events which start attracting these capital. So that's one.
Sure, Ravi.
About gender diversity more generally, I think it's a point very well taken. I think for us at Omidyar Network, it's something that across this year, it's something we're actually very committed to working harder on. I mean, frankly, I don't think it's something we have solutions on, but the fact that this is an issue is, I think, a point very, very well taken. And therefore, I think it's incumbent on institutions like us to do a better job at cultivating diversity. And that comes in many different forms. It's sort of diversity in our own thought on our teams internally. It's diversity among the entrepreneurs that we look to support. It's also diversity on the teams of the investees and the grantees that we partner with. And I think it's something we're actually committed to on all of those different fronts. One of the thoughts there that we have is that it's actually important to sharply be able to articulate the business case for why diversity is important. And we think that whether it comes to an individual organization, a network of entrepreneurs, and so on, there is a strong business case to be made. It's not something.
This word called hub. So I just wanted to give you a little bit more color to that. So what does a hub do? Hub is actually a place where we are bringing in those entrepreneurs or those people who have gotten to some point of success and create role models out of it. Most of the work that has been going on in the several different ecosystems has been about taking the very, very early stage and help them create something out of it, an innovation, a technology innovation, or the semblance of a business potentially. But after that, pretty much the resources and the network has tapped out of their capabilities to take it to the next level. So first of all, what a hub tries to do is create role models. As soon as there is a role model, a lot of you would, entrepreneurs would say, this guy was my colleague and she was my, classmate. If she can do it, I can do it too. So that creative aspiration, that creation of, understanding of this whole process begins to really create a lot of things. The other thing that the hubs do is about capacity building. while you asked a very pointed question about women, empowering them, but I would say, given the nature of the ecosystem broadly, I think it's about capacity building. As in, there is so much that needs to be done to really create a very clear understanding of whatever businesses you are in. If you're going from, you're creating an enterprise, you need a business plan, you need a business model, you need the business constructs, just like it would be applicable in the tech, in the venture space. There is no difference. It is as rigorous as as you would in the other space. You may not be aiming for profitability as much as the other ones do, but you definitely need the processes to be there. Your ability to articulate your business plan or business model, your ability to create that future DCF or whatever you are doing to create an understanding of how we are going to unlock value, and how are you going to create sustainability for an organization. Pretty much all of these things are applicable to any enterprise, in the social space as well. So I think it's an important thing for everyone to understand that that's how these things work. What we are also trying to do is, rather than a lot of them being sporadically happening in different places, how do we bring them all together? One is for us to bring in a lot of capacity building measures, but also unlocking the peer-to-peer network, because there's so much more. 80% of the work gets done by the peers themselves. And how do we make that happen? And to the last point, I just wanted to add to what Vineeth said. So he talked about an angel network. So when I was trying to organize something in the social space here in Hyderabad, then I reached out to Hyderabad Angels. I said, hey guys, you are kind of the lowest common denominator for me as an investor. You are people who have made some money, you're investing in some companies. Would you also be willing to invest in social startups, enterprises? And they said, no. We are only focused on this and therefore not focused on the other. So there is a clear demarcation. So while you may see in Economic Times and Axel or Mumbai Angels and all that, those are not the people necessarily who are going to invest in yours. There is a completely different set of people and they use different measures to evaluate you. A lot of them may be common with the other one, but you need to be very clear that you need to appeal to them and their mandates to their investors as well, so that they are able to meet their goals while they are helping you meet yours.
Thank you.
I would like to actually segregate this into two. One is an urban ecosystem and one is a rural ecosystem. Our experience has predominantly been with the rural settings, because we do work with a lot of self-help groups across the country. And we have seen that, there is a need for capacity building, which everybody has spoken about. But the idea is that these people, what we have realized, they don't even understand the concept of a business plan. What is a business plan for them is also an ingredient of a capacity building exercise, because you have to teach them about what a business plan is all about. I mean, we have worked in women empowerment and also women entrepreneurship, as you differentiated. So one of our programs was Internet Sati, which we did in collaboration with Google, where we were looking at empowering women by telling them how to use technology to, understand better, have a social standing, because, and we started training them. And we saw that they took a lot of interest, because typically in the rural settings, entire livelihood is being actually driven by the women itself. Whatever the woman actually earns is used for the family, and whatever the man earns is mostly for himself. That's the unfortunate situation which we have witnessed. So the training of this technology through YouTube and everything actually helped them immensely. They felt empowered, and then they started using some of these technology interventions by seeing videos, and started building their own businesses, which actually was a success story for us. We did not have to create a large ecosystem actually, but what we did was just train them in how to use a tab or a mobile phone, and they had the acumen to actually understand some of the videos and start their own businesses. So we have a lot of success stories. So the ecosystem development is very different in a rural context. There is a microfinance system which is enabling them. There is a training exercise which is carried out. So if you were to like take some learnings from this and see how we can adopt this in the urban setting today, like one is definitely everybody spoke about business planning, which is critical for any business to start. The second aspect is to understand the ground realities, because a lot of these solutions which we are coming up with today, whether this will be adopted by the communities or not. So the ecosystem should enable a platform where the entrepreneurs have a testing ground, and that's where we can also help by providing this testing grounds, whether in a rural setting or an urban setting. Because there is no one size which fits all, because the problems which a city like Hyderabad or Mumbai faces today is very different from what a tribal region in Andhra or Jharkhand faces tomorrow. So you have to be very clear on where your solution is going to be implemented, and the ecosystem should enable a testing ground where you will be able to test this out so that you show results. Because if you test out a solution which is suitable for an urban market, in a rural setting it's not going to work because people don't understand it there. So that's where I think the ecosystem funding is available, but all these softer aspects the ecosystem needs to think about and ensure that it's provided to the entrepreneurs.
Sure, thanks. So I want to get a word in from the Mayor and the Secretary of the Trivandrum Municipal Corporation. Very briefly, two things. One is on how willing are you? Many of them spoke about reserving government contracts for innovators, for startups. How willing are you to do that? Has there been any experience in that, even as part of the Kudumbashree program? And the second is similar, sense of allocating a certain set of contracts to women entrepreneurs. So your take on this in the context of Kudumbashree and a lot of great work that has happened in Kerala. Feel free to speak in English or in Malayalam. We'll figure out somebody to translate. That should not be a problem.
Thank you, Corporation Secretary. As far as Kerala is concerned, government has simplified the procedures to women entrepreneurs through Kudumbashree mechanism, because if for a Kudumbashree unit is concerned, the government have relaxed store purchase manual for them, because the government agencies could directly engage with the Kudumbashree unit. They could directly involve this Kudumbashree unit for the relevant field they are interested with. So the procedures are simplified. As far as the government scenario is concerned, the women is having equality in almost all the senses, because our rules, regulations, as far as our constitution is concerned, it is a guaranteed one. That is why there is no sort of inequality the women is facing in government field. Especially the Kerala, the social indices are very high. Or the women is having the highest level of education. That is why we are not facing any kind of inequality.
If I can just ask you a follow-up question, what about for startups in general? Taking up from the experience of Maharashtra Innovation Society, where what they seem to have done is they have identified a cohort of startups and they have made procurement easier for those who have been sort of empaneled, if I may say that, by the Innovation Society. Has some experiment like that been tried out for entrepreneurs in general, not just women entrepreneurs?
Yes, sir. The Kerala government has simplified the procedures for the startup groups. As far as Trivandrum Municipal Corporation is concerned, we have recently engaged a startup group for our septage disposal. There is online facility for the septage disposal. As far as Trivandrum Municipal Corporation is concerned, we have a centralized treatment plan having the capacity of 107 MLD. Trivandrum Municipal Corporation has generated only 133 MLD septage per day, but our network coverage is not adequate to cater the needs of the public. That is only 68 MLD septage is transferred to our centralized treatment plan. That is why the people have to depend on private suckers for transferring their septage. That created ultimate chaos to our environment, because these private tankers dump their waste in the open spaces.
So you have amended, did you amend your procurement rules or was it done at the
Sir,
state
we
government?
have formulated a bylaw that is based on the Kerala Municipality Act. We could formulate bylaws. That is section 563 of the Kerala Municipality Act. That is entrust the municipal corporation or the municipal councils could formulate bylaws to
Appoint startups as
needs.
As potential contractors.
Yes,
Thank
sir,
you.
yes,
Thank you.
sir.
Both of them are useful.
Can I just step in?
I want
Just 1 second. Just to continue her point, because there are many participants, city representatives from Andhra and Telangana.
Sure.
Just 1 point, ma'am, just to continue to your point. I think there's a lot to learn from the Kudumbashree model.
Yes.
So while we have MEPMA in Telangana and Andhra, it largely focuses on microfinancing. Yes, it does have skilling programs, but this entire structured approach, because oftentimes a lot of skilling is done and then the entrepreneur is left to herself or himself to sort of take care of sustenance. However, the structured approach that Kudumbashree takes builds a lot of discipline. And we notice that many NGOs, I don't know if Maya has faced this issue, but many NGOs are struggling to bring that discipline also in the women entrepreneurs whom they are promoting. So I think the states of Andhra and Telangana have a lot to learn from this model.
Sure, thanks for that. I did find an important point. It links very closely to the conversation we've had here, and we had a chat on the sidelines yesterday of the need to define value being created by social enterprises slightly more expansively than the definition that the traditional VC ecosystem has given. Because on one hand, the social cost of traditional businesses is not accounted for at all. And the social value add of social enterprises is also not accounted for properly in monetary terms. So there is a need for us to think of value slightly more expansively, and Ajitji has some interesting thoughts on that. A couple of minutes, 2 minutes if I may.
Thank you, Srikanth. Then ISB had a Goldman Sachs 10,000 Women Entrepreneurs Program, highly successful. We trained 1,500 of those, all of whom are doing well. I'm told ISB has restarted that program recently. Please reach out, isb.edu website and check out. It's a fantastic one. For rural entrepreneurs who are working in the rural space, Access Livelihood Consulting does a phenomenal mini MBA. Again, work consulting also only for women. All right, so that's one thing. I think we have a combined problem. Many of these startups are not able to scale up because for them, each scale up is different and discrete as compared to what happens in the digital space. Right? And for that scale, each order, they need money. And what the municipality says, you haven't scaled up, so I won't give you money. The venture capital says, so I think the venture capital or the funding agencies have to change their mindsets and start supporting startups which have an ability to create a big impact. The other thing, especially in WASH, is that calling it a revenue model, I think, is wrong. We have to call it an impact model. Because, to clean up somebody's shit, man, that's not going to give you revenue. Let's be honest about it. And the reason it's happening is because the municipal corporations do not also have the funding to really do it on a scale and pay you commercial rate. So there is a huge impact to having a clean society. As a society, we benefit. And this is where things like impact bonds and others come in. And I think we have not. So if you actually look at the social cost of many of those institutions that you fund, you don't take that into account. And similarly, you are not taking into account the societal benefits. And I think the entire VC and investment community has to change and has to think partly as philanthropists do, but think in terms of an overall societal return, especially on issues like WASH.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a question and not a comment. We are running out of time, so sir, please make it a question to the panel. So I want a question. At this stage, I want to take questions specifically to the panel on scale, business plan, any other aspects, any areas where you need help to unlock capital.
Yeah, it would be the question to Mr. Ravi.
Sure.
And through you to rest of the people. The same thing with Mr. Ajit said and Mr. Ravi touched. It is about an impact, but for impact you have to go deep. If you look at the market, that has to be a solution. If we work on the market today, tomorrow, who will be coming with very, very flimsy things, and I don't think that is good to do. Kindly, sir, Mr. Ravi, help us there.
Keep this further.
That the impact with a deep knowledge, it is created, then it will go across the globe.
The long-term nature of that.
Long-term.
Yeah, great question. Any other startups want to ask a question? Yeah, I can see a lady in the third row. But make it a pointed question on scale, business plan, any support that you need.
My query is to the whole panel. We've crossed that stage, we've been bootstrapping, we've crossed that stage of pilot projects. So I want to understand what kind of support we can get in terms of mentorship and finance, because at times we qualify for projects, but because we are cash strapped, we are not able to take them on. So in terms of working capital or in terms of financing projects, what kind of ecosystem can we develop?
Sure.
Any other part of scale, right? Isn't that the risk that VCs? Isn't that what VCs consider as the risk, right? So I've been cleaning toilets for 10 years, and I scaled it up to 6 cities, 40 crores in contracts, but I could not get a single VC to fund the working capital event.
Sure. Thanks.
Each of them is unique. So I don't have one particular product when it comes to sanitation. India with this demographic divide makes it difficult, so it has to be customized. So in that being the case, and government being the biggest investor when it comes to sanitation, it's very difficult as an individual to raise funds, and I haven't got banks nor any VCs ready to fund, having still showcased 23 successful models till date.
Great question and relates to what I did. Sure. Okay, so what I'd like to do is now...
Sorry, this is a fundraising question specifically.
Yeah, can I please request people handing over the mic?
There is almost limited to no capital coming from UHNIs in the wash sector.
Okay.
So today in the panel, when you say that they take the early stage funding, that's not the case. Maybe then you guys, since you'll have the platform, is there a way to dialogue with UHNIs to take that responsibility on?
Sure, thank you. These questions, and we could start with Bharath.
So I think just responding to the question about fundraising in particular, there were a couple of them that came up. Look, I think that this is a theme that has come up in the course of some of the comments the other panelists have made as well. There are different types of capital, and I think you need to understand what is the business plan that will appeal the most to each of those different types of capital. I mean, the comment as well about the fact that a lot of this is about impact and not necessarily about financial impact or revenues or financial return. Absolutely fair point. And there are types of pools of capital that are interested in that type of outcome, right? And so understanding what sort of nature of capital you're pitching your story to, and therefore how to tailor your story to each of those audiences, I think is a core part of the fundraising skill that I think entrepreneurs in this space need to build. And I think it is a different skill. It is a hard skill from someone who's running a much more sort of contemporary business, which is sort of generating great revenues, and therefore the story is financially at least a lot simpler to tell. But I think that's a core part of the skill that has to be built, because at the end of the day, for the comments around people who say VCs are not funding this, well, VCs are probably looking for financial returns, which is why they're not funding. And so the question becomes, and yes, it is a hard question, I acknowledge that, but of finding the other pools of capital that are actually interested in the story that you're looking to tell. And if that's not, if it's not quite tailored to each of the types of capital that you're trying to attract, then that's where your failure rates will probably be high. So that's one. I think it was a theme across a few questions.
And if I can put each of you on the spot, if it's to one entrepreneur, or could be to say that you can email me for any connects or any of that, anything from your end that between ON and you would be willing to do. So I'm not being I'm not pointing you out. I'm going to ask this to each person. So
emailing me for a while, I commit to getting back to you.
Great.
Here's someone questioning some question around working capital.
Yes, there was a question from there, the lady there, and the gentleman there as well.
Right. So I'm not too sure whether I'm borrowing Eric's idea of on that. But there are many DFIs like the USAID, like other foundations who have come up with something which is guaranteeing a bank to provide loans to all these people. Okay, so I'm talking about the blended finance mechanism, the DCA mechanisms, which are guarantees actually supporting the startups. The prima facie thing is to identify which are the pools of capital, like my friend said, which are the pools of capital who are willing to support your kind of business. So maybe, I mean, this is broad, but maybe at a very early stage you need to establish a pilot, so you might be looking for a grant money. A funder who is willing to look at impact and to promote or pilot a product. Maybe at the next stage you are looking at a seed capital, and then slowly when you start earning revenues, you are looking at a VC or a commercial fund. The impact investor does come in between, but he is also expecting a return. So there are mechanisms which, as I said, Eric would provide more details on. And part of one commitment, I mean, I've been open to all startups, and Intellecap is one of the ecosystem builder who has been feeding all the startup ideas to Avishkar as well. So out of the entire pipeline which Avishkar creates, 50% is contributed through Intellecap. So all the conferences which we attend, all the startups we meet, we have been sharing those details with them, and I hope to do that same here as well.
Grab their business cards.
So I'm too happy to answer this question. USAID is very supportive of SMEs in the WASH space. In fact, we recently signed an agreement with 3 different banks to promote access to credit for folks like yourselves. For startups, the bank that we're partnering with is Svakarma. For kind of medium-sized enterprises, we're looking at Caspian, and then for larger commercial entities, we're looking at Indocin. Keep in mind that these are their decisions to be made, whether or not you or your company will pass their criteria. It is not our decision, but we have signed this agreement, so we're hopeful to provide access to capital for folks like yourselves. One commitment that I'm happy to make today is that I'm more than happy to share this, I would call it a pipeline, but there's a bunch of cards here that have the names of the companies and contact information, and I imagine it's the room's information, and I'm more than happy to share this information with those 3 banks that I just mentioned. And so this is generally how USAID mobilizes domestic capital, is signing credit guarantees with banks that are banks and impact investors and other types of capital, private capital that are trying to get into a space, but maybe they just don't have that comfort just yet. So we're hopeful to connect the dots with you folks here today.
Yeah, so I wanted to sum up what I just said earlier, as in, there are 2 different words. While you take venture and you take capital, you would say, okay, that's a place where there is capital for you. VC usually gets associated with a completely different set of investors, and those are people who will go for companies that will grow 10x, 100x, and those are the kinds of returns that they're looking for. So they have been mandated by their investors to do so. Similarly, there are other organizations on the social side which also have a certain mandate of an impact, or maybe some level of equity versus debt or blended financing. There is something that they have been told to do, and they will go look for them. The people that you interact with are equally sharp. They will ask the same kinds of questions, and they will evaluate you on the basis on what they are looking for. And therefore, you have to be prepared to make that happen. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point is, there are multiple instruments of financing that you need to understand. There are ways in which you can actually finance a working capital versus, a debt, the general debt that you can raise, versus just getting a grant from various places, to actually giving up equity. So you need to be able to discern what are the ways in which part of the business you're going to finance. Therefore, you are going to find the right provider of that financing and go to them and make the pitch appropriately. And that brings me to the last point, which is mentoring that you brought up. a lot of the times it's not because of the fact that there are no financiers or there are no investors out there in the ecosystem. It is the fact that you are not able to make a pitch to them in a way that you can actually help them participate in that in your enterprise. So that's where the mentoring piece comes in, and various other resources that we can bring to the table, and that's what an organization such as T-Hub and we all do. So we in Hyderabad have actually sought out to build the first social impact ecosystem in the country. We are looking to create 5,000 social impact entrepreneurs or startups in the next 5 years. So all the 25 plus whoever else you can reach out to, please reach out to us. We are trying to bring you all in and give you that a place where you can get the mentoring, the access to the right set of investors. We ourselves don't know who all are there in this ecosystem. It's not that well organized yet. But we will try and organize ourselves to make sure that we are able to serve you. So that is my offer to you. So please do reach out, and let's try and get this thing going as quickly as possible together. Thanks.
So, I would like to answer the question on the scale in the government. It's very difficult to scale up things, and we very well understand that because we do a lot of work with them. So I think it's a collective responsibility of all of us here to try and address this issue, because all the startups are not going to take off unless there is a scale option and there is somewhere government intervention, which is essential. We are also looking at innovative models like, there have been a lot of talk of impact investment, development impact bonds, but there's a social equivalent of that, which is called social impact bonds, where the government acts as the funder and then there is the risk investor. So we are trying to evaluate this with some of the progressive governments to start with. Look, there's a starting trouble everywhere, but once a model is well established, I think there'll be a lot more takers. So it's a collective responsibility here as funders, philanthropies, the private players, to address this issue, and we want to take this up in a big way, and we are doing that. In terms of our commitment, we are a philanthropy, so we can't give grants to for-profit companies, so that's out. But in terms of what we can do is, wherever you have new technologies where you want to test it out or whatever, we can help you in terms of providing access to some risk-averse locations, and because we have a large program called the Tata Water Mission, which looks at safe drinking water and sanitation issues across the country. So your solutions, if it's falling within our ambit of the locations and the problems which we are trying to solve, which I'm sure it will be because we're trying to solve a lot. So we'll be happy to evaluate and look at the technologies which you provide and have a discussion and take it forward. So that can make a commitment from our side. Yeah.
To all the startup entrepreneurs who are part of Inkit Wash, that while not all of you may grab headlines like a Flipkart or an Ola or an Oyo, the fact of the matter is that the social value that each of you is potentially creating and the conviction of purpose that you have shown is truly tremendous and unprecedented, and far exceeds the value of headlines and the combined valuation of many of the private sector companies. Because what you're doing is truly transforming lives of people. And I'm fairly confident. I work in an NGO that's part of a larger group of organizations which includes social enterprises, and my bosses Swati and Ramesh Ramanathan have raised close to $1 billion of capital being social entrepreneurs, and they work across both philanthropy funded and social enterprise organizations. And I can tell you that what really makes this work and helps you go the long distance is what is called urgent patience. Urgency in efforts and patience with results, obviously fueled by conviction and purpose. So hats off to all of you, many congratulations. And